It was the scoop of the century.
WikiLeaks lifts the curtain on the secret communications between Washington and the diplomats that we have stationed all over the globe.
I'm not aware of any release of information in human history comparable to the amount that was released via WikiLeaks.
These were cables that showed us Superpower's secret thoughts.
250,000 US diplomatic messages apparently stolen by one of their own soldiers. Turned into a global sensation by a whistleblowing website and its controversial founder, Julian Assange.
I like crushing bastards.
We've dug deep into the cables to uncover stories America did not want you to hear, the difference between what the US says in public and what it says in private. Last time we revealed from the cables how America treats its allies. Now we investigate how it confronts its nightmares, like how it struggles with Russian aggression.
Russia was laying down a marker and saying, we're still the big dog in the neighborhood and you have to work with us.
China's rising economic power.
The level of United States debt to China is a national security concern.
And its military might.
They have a targeted approach to identify our vulnerabilities.
And the ultimate threat, an Iranian bomb.
I've had 3 American presidents saying Iran getting a weapon is unacceptable.
From our detailed examination of the secrets within the cables, we ask if America, in an increasingly defiant world, faces losing its dominance.
It's not a superpower that can click its fingers and expect the rest of the world to come to heel.
There has never been a country as powerful as the United States. Tens of thousands of diplomats around the world report to Washington on the business of the empire. They communicate through secret cables that were never meant to be seen by the rest of the world. Because of the WikiLeaks release, we can all read their private thoughts. Some of these cables were light-hearted, reporting on scandalous rumours and the pursuit of America's ideals in the world. Others were darker.
The Saudi government is still one of the major supporters of terrorism around the world.
There are secret reports of old enemies flexing their muscles.
Russia's military operations are consistent with its desire to regain its empire.
And dire warnings of the dangers of Iran with a nuclear weapon.
Al-Qaeda is not going to get a nuclear bomb. Iran is just a matter of time.
Publication of confidential U.S. diplomatic cables by the website WikiLeaks.
WikiLeaks. The founder, Julian Assange, is now on Interpol's most wanted list.
Russia has dismissed fresh WikiLeaks disclosures.
Once again, some of the leaks are embarrassing, but some could be dangerous.
Revelation of all of these documents is extraordinarily embarrassing for the United States.
This disclosure is not just an attack on America's foreign policy interests. It is an attack on the international community.
We've spent months analysing all 250,000 leaked cables. Taken together, they offer a striking new analysis of the state of the superpower. They show a nation struggling to achieve its goals, facing defiance around the world, and locked into confrontation with old enemies and with new ones. Reading the cables, there is a fear that has never really gone away. Russia. The secret documents showing the rise to power of Vladimir Putin in control of a more hostile Kremlin gives America sleepless nights. Russia's aggression is played out in the former Soviet states at its border. Bizarrely, one of the people recorded in the secret documents pointing this out is Prince Andrew. One cable describes a lunch the prince attended in the tiny Central Asian state of Kyrgyzstan.
Astonishingly candid, the discussion at times verged on the rude from the British side. Snap the Duke. The Americans don't understand geography. Never have.
But behind the bluster, Andrew had a serious message. He referred to a new great game, a struggle with Russia for control in the region.
He stated baldly that the United Kingdom, Western Europe, and by extension, you Americans too, were now back in the thick of playing the great game. More animated than ever, he stated cockily, and this time we aim to win.
One of Andrew's great concerns, as reported in the secret cables, was Russia's increasing efforts to gain influence in Central Asia. The prince's warning that Russia was a growing threat is reflected in many cables. This cable quotes the Kazakh ambassador to Washington. He says the Russians want the Americans out.
Russia has zero-sum tunnel vision and wants you totally out of Central Asia.
We tracked the ambassador down. It quotes you. I'm not saying that this is you, but this is what the Americans were telling themselves that you said. Whether you like the term or not, Russia is playing a new great game for all it's worth and wants you totally out of Central Asia.
Of course, this is a quote of me by someone else. I do not take it as a truth. He has interpreted maybe me.
Seems very clear, though.
No, what I was trying to say, we will have very close and meaningful relationship with Russia. But I doubt that I said that Russia wants to kick you out, completely out of the region.
The cables reveal how diplomats work, the often large gap that exists between public and private. You will say, as part of your job, one thing to me and our viewers in an interview, but behind closed doors, you might say something different to somebody.
No, in normal life, what you say at home sometimes is a bit different from what you say outside the home, right?
Finally, we can go beyond the public statements and official platitudes and hear what diplomats really say behind closed doors, particularly on the subject of Russia. This is one of the great stories of the cables. The Cold War may be over, but America's confrontation with Russia has never really ended.
Secretary of State Hillary Clinton relays concerns about Russian plans to transfer the S-300 long-range air defense system to Iran.
The Russians are aggressively playing a high-stakes covert game, and they consider few, if any, holds barred.
First, I'd like to congratulate President Putin for being the only person that caught a fish today.
We've got one fish, but that was a team effort, and the merit goes to the captain of
Very thoughtful of you.
In 2007, publicly, the US was trying to show how close the two countries were, Bush and Putin acting like the best of friends.
I have come to the conclusion that when Russia and America speaks with, along the same lines, it tends to have an effect.
But as they were cozying up for the cameras, privately US diplomats were gathering worrying rumors about the state of Russia.
There is no real rule of law, and at any time, anyone can be arrested or businesses destroyed. He commented that given the many irregularities and fraud that took place, the elections were not legitimate.
The prosecutor considers Russia to be a virtual mafia state.
And the cables show these views were held at the highest levels. Former Defense Secretary Robert Gates regularly met the most senior Russian politicians and commanders. We can now see his private thoughts.
Secretary of Defense Gates observed that Russian democracy has disappeared, and the government was now an oligarchy run by the security services.
Do you still stand by that?
I guess I wouldn't say that democracy has disappeared, but I would say it's under real challenge.
Dissidents and spies, politicians and journalists. The Americans get their information from anyone who's prepared to talk. We've tracked down one of the key informants in Moscow. Sergei Kanev is an investigative reporter for one of Russia's independent newspapers.
Как ни горько это признать, и как не стыдно за свою страну, за мою несчастную, это именно так. Мафиозная страна.
Kanev helps us understand how the cables are assembled. American diplomats pursue gossip and rumour gathered up by the armful. He says he was called by the US Embassy and asked to meet an official called Sonia.
Я уже где-то там, около американского посольства, в каком-то мы ресторанчике с ней сели, пили кофе, и я ей все рассказывал. Она делала все, смотрела, нет ли никого рядом, там какие-то мужчины все подходили.
She clearly took him seriously. Kanev's views were wired back to Washington.
Kanev told us everyone knows that Russia's laws do not work.
But Kanev says this was low-level intelligence gathering. The woman he met appeared almost naive and seemed to know little of Russian life.
Понятное дело, что она... То, что я ей рассказывал, он этого никогда не слышал. Допустим, как сотрудники ФСБ или МВД похищают людей, потом требуют за них. Она, конечно, этого не знала, она вот сидела так, удивляя, а что у вас такое есть? Я говорю, да.
He told us that people often witness officials going into the Kremlin with large suitcases and bodyguards, and he speculated that the suitcases are full of money.
The cables show that there were increasing concerns about Putin's attitude to the West. And America's sources don't hold back in their descriptions of him.
Putin's eyes turn to those of a killer.
The Irish Prime Minister referred to Putin as a slippery character.
The cables show the Americans particularly worried about Putin's attitude to the countries around Russia.
Is there a sense, do you think, that the Russians are trying to exert a bit more influence in the countries around their borders?
No question about it.
Should we be worried about that?
We are worried about it, and it's why we try to counter it.
One of the ways they did this was to encourage these border countries to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. The military alliance of Western countries formed to counterbalance Russia during the Cold War. The cables report Putin's attitude to NATO.
Putin allegedly said it was in Russia's interest that NATO no longer exists.
For 50 years, NATO had been America's first line of defense against Russia. But in recent years, it had expanded, and former Soviet countries were now part of the alliance. And to Russia's fury, NATO was now at its border.
Putin being himself, a very aggressive guy, he viewed this as a very aggressive act. He felt he had to kind of break out of this encirclement that he saw NATO as having planned for him.
The Russians started to behave aggressively to those wanting to join NATO, like the small ex-Soviet state of Georgia. One cable reports Russia in an exchange about the supply of gas, demonstrating its power.
The vice chair of the Russian parliament said, "We already warned you. Either you are on your knees to us, or your people will freeze every winter.
By 2008, American advisors were training Georgian troops, and negotiations for their country to join NATO were at an advanced stage. At that moment, Georgia's tensions with Russia turned to violence. The early cables reflect America's horror.
The embassy is preparing for an expected humanitarian disaster as continued Russian attacks are inflicting terror on the population.
At the start of the crisis, the US was careful to condemn the violence on both sides.
This situation can be resolved peacefully. We've been in contact with leaders in both Georgia and Russia at all levels of government. We have urged an immediate halt to the violence and a stand down by all troops.
But the secret cables show that even though Georgia made the first strike, from the start of the fighting, US diplomats were seeing the confrontation through Georgia's eyes.
Comment. All the evidence available to the country team supports the statement that this fight was not Georgia's original intention.
Many of us felt that the idea of Russian tanks rolling into a neighbouring country had been banished with the end of the Cold War.
What were the US saying?
They were furious, and they believed that this was a bad reversion to Cold War-style politics.
Many Russians believed there was more to this than a mere border dispute. Sergei Karaganov was an advisor to the Kremlin.
In political terms, we were stopping the logic of indefinite NATO expansion. It was a confrontation with NATO, which we won. That's it.
Russia was laying down a marker and saying, we're still the big dog in the neighborhood and you have to work with us.
There were very, very high tensions. Famously, the Russian foreign minister used some expletives to me in a phone call at the time of the crisis. So it was a very charged atmosphere. And the spectre was of real conflict, not of a military kind, but of a diplomatic, ongoing diplomatic conflict.
Those tensions between the West and Russia were plain to see. But the cables allow us to go inside the room to see the extraordinary personal nature of the confrontation between the West and Russia. The Americans report that when the French President Nicolas Sarkozy meets the Russians to talk about a peace plan for Georgia, he ends up attacking the Russian foreign minister.
The atmosphere during the negotiations was quite charged and at times became openly hostile. Sarkozy at one point grabbed Foreign Minister Lavrov by the lapels and called him a liar in very strong terms.
Russia routed Georgia's army, and America was powerless to stop it. The cables show how other countries around Russia reacted to the war. For the first time, we can see the dramatic effect. This cable reflects the fear felt in the former Soviet state of Estonia.
Since last year's war in Georgia, Estonian opinion makers now believe a Russian invasion of the Baltics is a possibility.
Any country that was formerly part of the Soviet Union, that was formerly a republic of the Soviet Union, would have looked what happened to Georgia and thought, well, this is a real worry. They're small countries living next to a very big country. And that always induces feelings of fear, and I think there's no question that the Georgia crisis exacerbated that.
Estonia was already a member of the NATO alliance. But in 2008, after the war in Georgia, that was no longer enough to make it feel safe. What the Baltic states wanted was a plan. They'd been in NATO for 4 years, but unbelievably, there was no strategy in place to protect Estonia from attack. Kurt Volker was the US ambassador to NATO.
Now, I came at this from having worked on NATO issues for 20 years, and my instinctive reaction was that what they're asking for is perfectly normal. It's a defensive alliance. Our obligation by treaty is to defend each other if attacked, and the prudent and responsible thing to do is therefore make plans. There was initially a murmur or a wave that said, oh, no, that would be provocative.
And for the first time, the cables allow us to see into this secret crisis at the heart of the Western alliance. Throughout 2009, attempts were made to come up with a plan. But it's clear from the cables, in private, America's allies in Europe were nervous. They didn't want to do or say anything that might suggest confrontation with Russia.
Many allies will take great pains to avoid even the suggestion that the alliance and Russia are on course toward a new Cold War.
This is now a serious issue for the West. If NATO can't agree on a plan to protect the nervous Baltic states from Russia, then NATO itself is threatened. So this is a kind of Cold War-style crisis happening in the 21st century and happening in secret. The issue being how the West protects itself from Russian aggression.
Unless consensus can be achieved within the alliance, the Baltic states will continue to lose faith in the alliance, undercutting a key U.S. strategic objective.
These were very sensitive times. At the end of 2009, NATO made a public approach to Russia for help in Afghanistan. In private, they were concluding plans, known as Eagle Guardian, to protect the Baltic states from any Russian threat. The plans made clear where NATO units were to be deployed in the event of an attack. But it was decided to keep the plan secret and not just to keep it from the Russians. We found a cable that suggests the secrecy was essential to the unity of NATO itself.
Public discussion of the plan would also make it much more difficult for some allies to support Eagle Guardian, creating divisions within the alliance and throwing the whole project into doubt.
An American nightmare was coming true. Rumors of the Eagle Guardian plan had already been around before the cable release. But through WikiLeaks, the Russians could now see the detail.
Я считаю, что то, что произошло сегодня, потеря лица, это удар по репутации Североатлантического альянса.
And some in Russia believed the deal and the secrecy showed how weak NATO had become.
It showed us simply that the obvious fact that NATO is not a very unified alliance. Nobody in Europe wants the return of the Cold War like some weird persons in the White House or in the State Department. I dare to say to my military commanders that if we wish we could attack, NATO would collapse.
After the whole cable release, there was fury in the Russian government at the way their country had been portrayed, and with the people who had helped the Americans.
Все с интересом. Ну, с другой стороны, я слышал там, вот, ты с ней встречал, ты предатель Родины. Ну, это бред. Я даже не придавал значения, кому потом она передаст то, что я... Я же не врал ничего, правильно? Мне чего бояться-то? Вот, ну... Вот так. Ощущение потом, конечно, когда все прочитал, как будто в щелочку смотрели на меня, как будто я раздевался и вот это подсмотрели.
The cable leak affected relations at the highest levels.
What do you think it did to the relationship between the United States and Russia?
Without any question, individual relationships are harmed, and many ambassadors will tell you that they were harmed, that relationships they had spent a long time building, there's a real chill.
America's alliances weren't strong enough to contain its old enemy, Russia. But the cables show the US also has a difficult relationship with the world's rising power, China. The United States has to tread carefully when it deals with China. No other nation comes as near to the United States economically, and China continues to develop its military machine. The cables reveal a major military confrontation with China that happened largely in secret. It started in January 2007 when, without warning, the Chinese army shot down one of their own satellites.
They know how dependent we are on satellites for intelligence, communications, and so on, thus their development of an anti-satellite capability. They have a sophisticated, targeted approach to identify our vulnerabilities.
Privately, the Americans registered their anger at the Chinese move, but they were determined to keep public relations warm.
We don't want to see a situation where there is any militarization of space.
I believe there is reason to be optimistic about the U.S.-China relationship.
Behind the scenes, things were very different. The two powers were now locked into a confrontation about military power in space, and the tone of the cables was direct and angry.
Any purposeful interference with U.S. space systems will be interpreted as an escalation in a crisis or conflict.
And what's interesting, in contrast to the public pleasantries, is the open aggression in the cables sent to the Chinese. In one cable, sent from the then US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, the familiar tactful language has gone.
The United States reserves the right to defend and protect its space systems with a wide range of options, from diplomatic to military.
Assistant Secretary of State Christopher Hill was one of those taking the lead in America's diplomacy with the Chinese.
Condoleezza Rice, she sends a very robust cable. It even raises the prospect of the use of force. So that's an amazing sense of aggression and tension.
She was obviously angry with the Chinese, as we all were. She really did let them have it, and I think they deserved it.
This is the cables at their most revealing. The language now being traded between the US and China is fierce. The Chinese response to the American cables is just as aggressive.
The United States should stop airing its gratuitous suspicion, groundless accusations, and endless quibble on this issue.
Certainly, we put down a marker with the Chinese and made it very clear that we care about this. The Chinese are not going to say, oh my goodness, we're sorry we did it and we'll never do it again. Instead, they came back with a very nasty statement of their own.
The next message from America was not diplomatic. This is the USS Lake Erie operating in the Pacific in the spring of 2008. The Americans are about to shoot down one of their own satellites. In public, America said that the satellite was out of control, but from the cables, we know the background, and the message to China wasn't subtle.
And then you shot down one of your satellites?
That's right.
Was that to teach them a lesson?
No, actually it was to prevent the satellite from falling to Earth, but it clearly had the ancillary benefit of demonstrating an important capability.
The more you dig into the cables, the more the complexity of America's relationship with China is revealed. Despite China being their closest rival, the cables show the lengths America will go to make the Chinese happy. This became dramatically clear in 2008 when China hosted the Olympic Games.
Oh, someone, as I speak, someone has tried to grab the torch from Connie Huck, the former Blue Peter presenter. A man.
Protesters, angry at China's human rights record, tried to disrupt the journey of the Olympic torch around the globe. This seemed to be the perfect moment for America to take a stand.
We believe in human rights and human dignity. We believe in the human condition. We believe in freedom. And we're willing to take the lead.
Well, I remember when the torch runners came to San Francisco, we wanted to try and avoid some of the same incidents that, if I remember correctly, had occurred in Europe, where they had been prevented from getting to their destination.
On the day the torch was to be paraded through San Francisco, the route was shortened and changed at the last moment. It was one of the few places in the world where the journey of the torch was not interrupted by protesters. America betrayed one of its own ideals, the right to protest, to appease the Chinese. And a cable from the American embassy in China suggests the gamble paid off.
The lack of major incidents at the torch run in San Francisco earned us goodwill and gratitude in Beijing and has given us a degree of leverage.
Some world leaders decided not to attend the Games themselves because of China's human rights record, but America chose to go. It was another US attempt to show support for China.
I'm going to the Olympics. I view the Olympics as a sporting event. I am not going to go and use the Olympics as an opportunity to express my opinions to the Chinese people in a public way, because I do it all the time with the president.
It was an important statement by George W. Bush. That we value the relationship, we understand the importance of this issue to you. And so that when we have issues that we say are important to us, we hope you will also pay attention. That's the message.
But did the strategy work? One of the issues America often raised was the human rights of Chinese citizens.
Contacts corroborated international reports of increased detentions and harassment of Chinese human rights activists and dissidents in the lead-up to the president's visit. U.S. political officer conveyed the United States government's deep concern, noting reports that a lawyer was severely tortured.
We would raise specific cases. Particular individual, noted individual who's being detained, who we would urge that they release. We invariably tried to do it more in private than in public, just in terms of not antagonizing the Chinese. This is always a very delicate balance.
Now, thanks to the cables, we can see who America was trying to help behind closed doors and how they did it.
Ambassador expressed U.S. concern over the house arrest of Zhang Jinyan, the wife of imprisoned rights activist Hu Jia.
Individual cases were raised at the highest level. We've tracked this couple down. Hu Jia and his wife Zhang Jinyan are human rights campaigners and have been in conflict with the authorities for 6 years. This video, shot by the couple themselves, shows the sort of intimidation faced over those years. Zhang confronts the secret police who follow her every move. We could only reach her by video phone.
Plainclothes police started to monitor our apartment and started to follow us where we go.
In desperation, Zhang appealed to the American embassy for help. What did you think they would go and do?
I didn't expect too much. I hope they can contribute to Hu Jia's coming home. That's all.
What did they say to you? What did they say they would do?
They will try their best.
And now, thanks to the cables, we can see the Americans did raise the case.
The ambassador urged China to immediately release rights activist Zhang Jinyan.
But there are accusations that this effort was half-hearted.
A Chinese official denied that Zhang Jinyan's movements or communications were restricted. She was not under house arrest. Officials had taken no measures against her.
Sophie Richardson is a human rights expert who monitors China.
I think one of the things that the cables reveal is a gap between what people knew, which was quite a bit, and what they were actually doing about it, which was, I think, not nearly enough.
We can see in the cables America struggling to influence China in the way it would like. One of the reasons for this is China's new economic strength, a truth captured in one revelatory cable. Hillary Clinton is talking about China with her team from the State Department.
Secretary Clinton noted the challenges posed by China's economic rise, asking, "How do you deal toughly with your banker?"
After the financial crisis of 2008, America went cap in hand to China. By effectively lending the US billions of dollars, China saved the superpower's finances. The Chinese became America's largest foreign creditor. It marked a seismic shift in the balance of power between the two nations.
The level of United States debt to China is a national security concern. It gives China leverage that has significant policy implications. We understand that intellectually. We, as a government, are continuing to wrestle with what do we do about that.
In the months after the financial crisis, America bent over backwards to emphasize the warmth in its relationship with China.
I appreciate greatly the Chinese government's continuing confidence in United States treasuries.
But in private, American diplomats were watching China change, developing a new arrogance in its diplomacy. And in secret cables they thought we would never read, they make increasingly undiplomatic comments.
China is making no friends with its newly pugnacious attitude.
And America realizes its influence over China is diminishing. Diplomats secretly acknowledge that China is no longer listening.
Little progress had been achieved, and China had not acknowledged U.S. concerns.
And the cables report that China is even turning the arguments about human rights against America.
China recommended the United States focus on its own human rights issues and stop acting like a human rights god.
The Chinese do not shy away from using anger and from speaking very, very plainly on these things. Not all diplomatic engagements are decisive. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, and sometimes it just it doesn't change.
In the end, the cables track a failing strategy. A strong China chose to ignore a weakened America, and repression has worsened.
The reality is that we are 8 or 9 months into the worst crackdown we've seen in China in about 15 years.
And though the US raised her case at the highest levels, little has changed for Zhang Jinyan.
So what we see in that film, is that still going on?
Yes, now. Until now.
So there are people outside your house right now?
Yes.
And if anything, the WikiLeaks cables release has only served to harden the conviction of some in China that the Americans can't be trusted.
I think the cables, became grist for a very conservative, kind of hardline element in China, whose entire modus operandi, modus vivendi, is you must avoid talking to foreigners. You must be very careful dealing with foreigners.
The story of China, told through the cables, is a clear illustration of America's declining power. What we found is the United States struggling to deal with its new rival. But there are other nations that America sees as a far more direct threat. And going through the cables, we tracked one crisis as it grew ever deeper. America's ultimate nightmare is Iran, armed with a nuclear weapon. The start of 2012 has seen tensions rise between Iran and the West. The world's nuclear watchdog says it thinks Iran could be moving even closer to a nuclear weapon. The cables show how America tries and fails to stop its worst fear.
We have acquired substantial specific information that Iran has been secretly building another enrichment facility. This facility is too small to be viable for production of fuel for a nuclear power reactor. It may be well suited, however, for a military purpose.
It is possible Iran could have this capability, and we need to take it seriously. Now.
But despite America's fears and the president's strong words, the US has a weakness when it comes to Iran. Since the siege of their embassy in 1979, the US has never re-established diplomatic relations. It's one of the few places on the planet where there are no Americans sending cables. The vital flow of gossip was cut off.
In my view, we never know enough about what's going on inside, particularly inside the circles of power in Iran.
But by 2006, fresh Iranian nuclear plans meant that had to change. The US government created a web of informers called the Iran Watchers. We tracked down a State Department official who monitored their cables.
They started out in a handful of countries and European capitals, in Istanbul and Dubai. They would talk to Iranian businessmen, former Iranian diplomats, former Iranian government officials, academics, activists, students, intellectuals. They were what they call Iran Watchers.
The Iran Watchers are an extraordinary group, not quite spies, but crucial in the gathering of intelligence. The activities and identities of the Iran Watchers were supposed to be confidential. Now, thanks to WikiLeaks, those secrets are out.
An Iranian law professor well known in Iran Watcher circles offered his views on his childhood friend, President Ahmadinejad.
The new Iran Watcher position has increased our ability to report on Iranian activities in Azerbaijan.
A long-term operative for the Iranian Revolutionary Guards provided London Iran Watcher detailed written allegations.
As ever with the cables, it's the detail that's extraordinary. It's clear from the flow of information that one of Washington's key sources was based in London. He provided the Iran Watchers based in the UK with crucial information, and we've tracked him down.
The longtime embassy contact Ali Reza Nurizadeh passed a London Iran Watcher an allegation.
They contact me, Ali Reza, I am so and so, I am an American diplomat working for this office. I don't like to go to embassies or sitting in a coffee shop outside, then somebody see, oh, I saw Ali Reza talking to this American spy or something. So they come to my office, we sit, we talk.
Now we can read the secret intelligence he was passing on in the cables.
I had a very reliable source in Iraq. He gave me a lot of information about the Iranian agents in Iraq. I met an American diplomat. We talked about it.
That information was sent to Washington in a cable.
A Revolutionary Guard office is shipping large quantities of explosive penetrator devices for use against coalition forces in Iraq.
They are very happy that at least somebody else beside them is confirming that.
The cables dealt with a range of issues, and as ever, any gossip or information was coveted. In mid-2009, accusations of a rigged election in Iran led to violent protests on the streets. The Iran watchers picked up rumours of what was going on within the regime. Amongst them, reports of an astonishing account of a confrontation between Iranian President Ahmadinejad and the head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard.
Ahmadinejad's statements infuriated Revolutionary Guard Chief of Staff Mohammad Ali Jafari, who exclaimed, "It is you who created this mess." Source said that Jafari then slapped Ahmadinejad in the face, causing an uproar and an immediate call for a break in the meeting, which was never resumed.
It's one of the most shocking revelations in the cables, the sort of rumour the Americans were desperate for.
That was absolutely true. The knowledge about that event was only between a bunch of people, only about 7, 8 people. And when it came out, everybody was shocked.
You know, when you get a cable like that, that's a big deal. If it ends up being true, demonstrates very significant fissures within the Iranian government. The types of fissures that could potentially be irreparable, and the consequences, the repercussions of that potentially endless.
Whether the rumour is true or not is impossible to test, but it's clear the Iran watchers have plugged an intelligence hole for the US. Their significance is beyond doubt.
There's no question that since this process of the Iran watchers has been institutionalized, it's improved the understanding of Iran within the US government exponentially.
Their importance was also not lost on the regime in Tehran. Worrying cables started to filter back to Washington. It seemed the watchers and their sources were now targets.
A number of State Department Iran watchers have seen both professional contacts and friends in Iran suffer harassment, intimidation, detention, and worse.
And Ali Nourizadeh claims he was one of the sources targeted.
They tried to kill me. They sent their agent, a young man who came and showed too much interest in me. And he followed me for a while. I went to United States because he was an American citizen, so he just came back from Iran and met me in the United States.
Nourizadeh's claim is supported by a secret cable which identifies the young man as an Iranian called Sadakinya. The FBI was already secretly tracking him.
Sadakinya was arrested in California on charges of soliciting murder.
When he was arrested, he was trying to hire a killer. And the American arrested him, and he confessed. So one day, people from authority here, they came to my office, they talked to me, and they said, "You are very concerned. Once again, you were targeted. And this time by this man. He wanted to poison me." I was shocked. And I had to be vigilant and to be a bit more careful.
Sadakinya confessed to being an Iranian agent. Iran denies all allegations of an overseas assassination program. But such stories, together with Iran's continuing nuclear development, revealed a new, more aggressive Iran, and it's clear there was a growing concern in the Middle East at the prospect of Iran with a nuclear bomb. Some countries urged the United States to take military action.
How vociferously were you being urged to attack Iran?
People were pretty, some people were pretty aggressive in pushing it.
Who was it and what were they saying?
Well, I'm not going to go there.
But now we know, thanks to the cables. Many of the calls, perhaps not surprisingly, came from Israeli politicians, like Cabinet Minister Yuval Steinitz.
In Steinitz's view, Iran would not change its stance unless it saw that brute force might be used.
What we did, and we are still doing, is trying to encourage the Western world to handle this threat and to prevent it, because it's extremely dangerous threat, not just to Jews or to Israel or to the Middle East, but to the rest of the Western democratic civilization altogether.
But the cables also contained a much bigger revelation. It wasn't only Israel that was calling for action. It was Iran's Arab neighbors too, places like Saudi Arabia. In public, Saudi diplomats acted as though they wanted warm relations with Iran. Now, through the cables, we can read what the Saudis were saying in private, including their ambassador to the US, Adel al-Jubeir. The difference is striking.
The Saudi ambassador recalled the king's frequent exhortations to the US to attack Iran and so put an end to its nuclear weapons program. He told you to cut off the head of the snake.
In public, the Americans didn't distance themselves from military action. They made clear all options against Iran were on the table.
Our message to the leaders of Iran is also clear. America will confront those who threaten our troops. We will stand by our allies, and we will defend our vital interests in the Persian Gulf. The enemy has made its intentions clear.
The US strategy was to talk tough. But the cables show what they were actually thinking. For years, the Americans were quite clear. They didn't want another war.
The United States government wants to find an option other than military confrontation.
So what could America do? It didn't want to fight, and Iran didn't seem keen to talk. Well, faced with such limited options, they chose a different path, to try and strangle the Iranian regime with sanctions. But the cables show this policy failed. There wasn't enough international support. The documents show that, in America's opinion, countries like Germany said one thing in public, but another in private.
Despite tough talk on Iran in public, senior German officials tell us in private that Germany remains again reluctant to pursue sanctions.
In the end, only limited sanctions were introduced, and these made little difference. The US is still faced with its worst nightmare.
Let me give you a very dark scenario, and I hope we never get there. We're kind of speeding along a highway. I call it the Iranian nuclear program highway. And a lot of off-ramps are starting to show up in our rearview mirror. You know, the off-ramp about sanction them, the off-ramp about engage them. And we're speeding towards and it's, okay, I can make out there's a fork in the road down there, and oh, I can even make out the signs. And the fork in the road says, do something or do nothing. That's a horrible place to be. I've had 3 American presidents, 3 successive presidents saying Iran getting a weapon is unacceptable. And as a native speaker, I think I know what unacceptable means.
The recent announcement from the UN's nuclear watchdog that Iran is enriching uranium has moved the unacceptable much nearer the reality. Years of effort have failed to stop Iran's desire to get a nuclear bomb, an event the Americans believe would have grave consequences.
Iran will use the possession of nuclear weapons to intimidate its neighbors. I think it also is very likely to spark a nuclear arms race in the region. At least one or two other countries probably feeling compelled to have nuclear weapons if Iran does. I think it's incredibly destabilizing, just as a war would be. If we've learned anything from Iraq and from Afghanistan, it's how unpredictable war is once it's started.
WikiLeaks exposed the uncomfortable reality of America's relations with Iran, China and Russia. But a year on, the impact of the cables hasn't finished yet. Bradley Manning, the man accused of leaking the cables, is still held in US military custody. He's due to go before a court-martial, but no longer faces the death penalty. Julian Assange is appealing against his extradition to Sweden on sexual assault allegations. He currently faces no charges in the US, though a grand jury continues to consider his case. And the website he founded has been subject to an unprecedented global financial blockade by companies including MasterCard, Visa and PayPal. Assange recently announced that the blockade has cut off 95% of WikiLeaks revenues and that it was suspending publishing. The website now carries this message. The WikiLeaks cables allowed us a glimpse behind the door to see a superpower's secrets. That door has now slammed shut. Many Americans believe long-term the leaks will not cause significant damage and the US remains the world leader.
The US is still the indispensable power. That nothing in the international environment gets done in a constructive way unless the United States plays a central role. And so what I saw as Secretary of Defense, WikiLeaks notwithstanding and everything else, is the vast majority of countries in the world that want a better, stronger relationship with the United States and where there is still enormous respect for all kinds of our power, political, economic, and military.
But others believe the cables show America is a declining power.
People were a bit disturbed how ineffective the United States were, that they were allowed these leaks. That came on the background of other failures of the US government, starting with Iraq through Afghanistan to the internal debt crisis. So that diminished the weight and the respect towards the United States, which is unfortunate.
I think the cables show the changing shape of power in the world. America remains the one global superpower, politically, economically, militarily. But it's not a superpower that can click its fingers and expect the rest of the world to come to heel.
Hidden in these secret documents are American dreams that died and nightmares that came true. They show the ambition, the scale, and at times the honesty of a superpower's secret life. And they also may reveal the places and problems that in the end might weaken US power for good.